Hello, everybody. We're going to go ahead and do this again, I guess. I want to read a poem by a poet friend of mine, organ poet, longtime organ poet. His name is Stephen Robert Heine. Stephen Robert Heine, I call him one of the best-selling organ poets that no one's ever heard of before. Let me tell you why. In 1977, or it might have been 76, I can't remember now, Steve decided he wanted to sell his poetry books at the Oregon State Fair. And so he bought himself a booth, one of those, big 10 by 10 booths outside on the big pavement out there. If you've ever been to the Oregon State Fair in Salem, you know what I'm talking about. They're out there selling t-shirts, they're selling, all kinds of stuff. Hot tubs, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so 1976 or 1977, that's what he did. He rented a booth and started selling his poetry books at the Oregon State Fair. I guess it worked because he did it for about 40 years, every year out there for however long the state fair is, 10 days, 12 days, something like that, 14, I don't know. There are literally hundreds of his poetry books throughout the state, bought at the Oregon State Fair. When you go to the state fair now, if you go there, you'll notice that it's the Oregon Authors Table. That's also Steve's idea. It's kind of expensive if you're just selling a book to have a big booth like that. It's kind of an expensive proposition. But what the Oregon Authors Table is you just have to purchase a small space on this big long table for a lot less money, and it makes it a lot more affordable. And now if you go to the state fair, there is 20, 30 authors out there. Steve's known as the first writer of the Oregon State Fair. He also wrote a history of the Oregon State Fair, which is probably one of his better selling books. And he also did he started the Oregon State Fair poetry competition, and he judged it for many years. He died in December, on December 15th. And so I didn't know about that until just recently. But I have one of his books here. This is one of the ones that he sold at the fair, called The Carpenter. He published this in 1980. And I think this book is actually from 1980. The pages are just a little bit yellow. I don't think they were yellow originally. But I wanted to read this poem called The Carpenter by Stephen Robert Heine. This is the poem. The Carpenter. As the sun... Oh, just a second. One other thing. I don't think you can find this online. I looked. I think you have to get the book. I don't know how you're going to do that because the guy who has the books isn't around to sell them to you anymore. Anyway, so here it is, The Carpenter. As the sun melts slowly into the hills, the silence is broken by two whippoorwills. The carpenter smiles and turns from his work, then hoists me upward with a muscular jerk. His old wooden pipe is still clenched in his jaw, and I teasingly steal it from my old grandpa. Then we walk a short distance and suddenly stop, where the tackle is stored in the back of the shop. When we left Milwaukee and came out here, Steve, the fishing was better than you'd ever believe. On the big Lucky Mute, where the nettles were few, I could nab my whole limit in an hour or two. Jasper passed away back in 43, but we nailed some lunkers, that logger and me. Come the 1st of May, every year we take the highway south to Diamond Lake. I'd catch 30 or 40 every time we went, on some banged-up flatfish and a reel that was bent. As he painted his stories, his old eyes would glisten, and excitement would fill me as I'd eagerly listen. I could see his pole bend, I could hear his reel grind, and his trophies would flop in the back of my mind. Then he'd set me down and flick off the light and close up the shop for another night. He was born in Germany. In Oregon he died. But he taught me the meaning of a craftsman's pride. And on dark winter days, I still find myself wishing that the carpenter could tell me another story about fishing. The Carpenter by Stephen Robert Heine. I wanted to say 3 things about this poem that I really admire. The first thing is, this poem is a pleasure to read. Steve he wrote light verse. One of the things about his light verse that makes it so attractive to me and admirable to me is that it is so easy to read. So easy to read. His lines don't have a standard syllable. These are all 4-line stanzas. The first line is generally 5 to 7. The second line is generally a little bit smaller. The third line is another one that's 5 to 7, and then the fourth line is another one that's 5 to 7. And then he's got a rhyme on the end of the second line and the end of the fourth line. So if we're reading this, as the sun melts slowly into the hills, comma, and the end of the second line, the silence is broken line by 2 whippoorwills, end of the stanza. So very easy to read. One of the things that makes this so easy to read is that even though his syllables aren't standardized, his rhythms are. And so a lot of times his lines will begin with 2 unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable. And then after that it gets sometimes just an extra syllable or 2 or less. Just kind of depends. But that as the sun, as the 2 unstressed syllables, sun. Third is the stressed syllable. Melts slowly. Melts. This is how I admire him, because I really have a hard time figuring out these stressed and unstressed syllables. But to me, it's just magical to be able to write something like this and then read it and have that kind of interior rhythm that just kind of like carries you through the lines. The second thing I think is very interesting about this poem and a lot of Steve's poems is his use of unusual words, and his use of unusual words in his rhymes. A lot of times when you're listening to rhymed poetry, or if you listen to like a song on the radio or whatever, if the writer is not using unusual words, sometimes when you're listening to the song, you can anticipate the next rhyming word. It used to be a game that we'd play back in the 80s or 90s. Would be like, okay, we're listening to the song, you can hear the line end. What's the next rhyme? What's the next rhyming word? And so, but even here in the first stanza, Steve kind of sets you up. And I'm going to get to like his use of unusual words kind of throughout in a minute. But here we are. As the sun melts slowly into the hills, the silence is broken by 2 whippoorwills. So it's hills and whippoorwills. Whippoorwills is and all of the rhymes that he does, there's no slant rhymes here. All of them are bang on rhymes. So he's got work and jerk, he's got jaw and grandpa, stop and shop, Steve and believe. It's just great. And just a lot of just really solid rhymes that make sense, not only make sense in the context of the poem, makes sense in the rhythm that the poem is based in. That's some geometry that is very difficult to do. And then he has other words in here that are also just kind of like unexpected words that kind of keep on piquing your interest. And I'll call a couple here. Lunkers, he's got. Flatfish, he's got in there. And somebody said there's trophies. And he has place names, which I think it grounds a poem in an actual location. If you have a place name in there, you know, not everything has got to be like this amorphous thing. I think that it grounds a poem in the real world sometimes, that we have a place name. And there's a lot of them in here. Milwaukee, which is Milwaukee, Oregon, by the way. Big Lucky Mute, Diamond Lake, and Germany and Oregon. So that's, I just find that just kind of like grounds the poem in the real world. And then finally, I wanted to go to the last stanza here and the subject matter of this poem. This is a poem about a son's love for his grandfather. It's a beautiful poem about that. The way he ends it, the last stanza, has some of those surprising words and something that I find typical of some of Steve's writing, which is, the last stanza is, on a dark winter's days, I still find myself wishing that the carpenter could tell me another story about fishing. He ends that rhyme ends on a contraction, which I don't want to say is typical, but not unusual for Steve to have that kind of drop the G off or make a contraction of the word, even a non-standard contraction of the word, and then use it in a rhyme or just have it as part of the words of the poem. But for me, what this says a couple things to end a poem like this. To me, it conveys a idea of intimacy, of closeness, wishing and fishing. It just has a familiarity about it that I think is endearing. That it, this is I don't want to say it's a formal poem, but it is set up as a formal poem, but at the same time, we're ending as a very familiar way of talking to somebody with the way that poem ends. Anyway, so those are some thoughts of Stephen Robert Heine's poem, The Carpenter. Who knows when we'll do this again. We'll try it again, maybe next week, maybe not. We'll see how I feel about it. Anyway, have a good day, everybody. We'll see you later.